In the quiet mountain town of Sierra Falls, 5 ruthless bikers thought they ruled the night, until they made one fatal mistake, picking a fight with Clint Eastwood. At 94 years old, the legendary actor and former mayor didn't need fists or threats. With nothing but calm composure and a single phone call, he turned the tables, leaving the gang handcuffed and humiliated. How did he do it? And why did the bikers turn pale when they saw who he called? Find out in this thrilling story, only on Voices of the Underdog. Like, share, and subscribe for more incredible stories. The night air in Sierra Falls carried a crisp chill, the kind that sent shivers down the spine of an unprepared traveler. But for 94-year-old Clint Eastwood, the cool mountain breeze was nothing more than a familiar whisper of the wild, a reminder of the countless evenings he had spent under the open sky. The small town of Sierra Falls had become his retreat, a peaceful haven far removed from the bright lights and the chaos of Hollywood. Here, he had found solace in simple things: a quiet walk through the dimly lit streets, the creak of the wooden porch outside his home, and the comfort of an old diner that still served the best steak and coffee he had ever tasted. Rocky's Diner, nestled at the heart of town, was more than just a place to eat. It was a relic, a steadfast reminder of the old days when men and women gathered over coffee and conversation instead of glowing screens. The neon sign buzzed softly in the distance, its warm glow casting long shadows on the pavement as Clint made his way toward it. His footsteps were steady, unhurried, just another late-night routine for a man who had seen too much to be easily shaken. But tonight was different. As he turned the corner near Main Street, the distant rumble of motorcycle engines sliced through the peaceful silence. The sound was unmistakable, deep, guttural, and relentless, like a pack of wolves circling their prey. 5 riders, their silhouettes dark against the dim streetlights, pulled up just ahead of him, their engines roaring before cutting to silence. The leader, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a scar running down his left cheek, stepped forward, his boots crunching against the gravel. His presence carried an air of authority, the kind that came from years of unchecked arrogance and fear tactics. Jack the Wolf Donovan, he smirked, tilting his head slightly as if appraising Clint. Late-night stroll, old man. This town belongs to us now. The others chuckled, their laughter laced with mockery. Clint slowed his steps but didn't stop. His eyes, sharp as ever despite his years, flickered toward Jack before sweeping over the rest of the group. Ray Mad Dog, a wiry man with a greasy beard, was the first to make a move. With a quick swipe, he snatched the tan Stetson off Clint's head, twirling it between his fingers like a prize. Well, look at this," Ray sneered. "Ain't this the washed-up cowboy? Thought you rode off into the sunset years ago." The rest of the group laughed again, emboldened by their leader's lack of response. But Clint didn't flinch. Instead, he simply lifted his gaze, that same legendary stare that once silenced entire rooms, that made even the toughest men in Hollywood's toughest westerns second-guess their next line. For a brief moment, the laughter died down. Jack noticed it too, and something about it unsettled him. He had seen fear in men's eyes before. He had seen them cower, beg, plead. But this old man, there was no fear, only the weight of time, of a life lived through wars, betrayals, and untold stories that none of them could begin to comprehend. And yet the arrogance in him wouldn't let him back down. Jack stepped closer, close enough that Clint could smell the faint stench of gasoline and stale cigarettes clinging to his leather jacket. He leaned in, voice dropping just enough to make sure the others didn't miss it. "You're in our territory now, old man, and in our town, everyone pays a toll." He extended a calloused hand, palm up, a silent demand. Clint exhaled slowly, the corner of his lip twitching in what could have been amusement or warning. He didn't respond right away, didn't react with anything but an almost irritating calmness. Instead, he reached forward not to hand over money but to take back his hat from Ray's grip. For a split second, Ray hesitated. His fingers twitched as if contemplating whether to tighten his hold or let go. But something in Clint's eyes, something deep, unreadable, made the decision for him. He let go. Clint dusted off the brim of his hat before placing it back on his head, adjusting it ever so slightly. Then, without a word, he resumed walking. Jack's patience snapped. With a sudden thud, he slammed a boot in front of Clint's path, blocking his way. "I don't think you understand," Jack growled. "We weren't asking." The group tensed, waiting for a reaction: anger, resistance, maybe even fear. But instead, Clint simply looked down at the boot, then back up at Jack, his expression unreadable. Then, in the same measured tone he had used for decades, on screen, in meetings, in the very halls of city politics, he finally spoke. "Move your foot." Jack blinked, momentarily caught off guard. The sheer audacity of this 94-year-old man giving him orders made his fingers twitch toward the knife on his belt. But before he could make a decision, a sound interrupted them. The ding-ding of a bell. Rocky's diner, just a few feet away, stood waiting, its doors open, its warmth spilling onto the cold street. Clint took a step forward, forcing Jack to make a choice. The leader of the bikers, despite his bravado, hesitated just long enough for Clint to brush past him. The others exchanged uneasy glances. This wasn't how these encounters were supposed to go. Their victims begged, pleaded, or ran. Not this. Never this. And yet they followed. Jack signaled to his men with a flick of his fingers. The group exchanged smirks, their momentary uncertainty replaced by their usual hunger for dominance. If the old man wanted to ignore them, fine. They'd just take the game inside. As Clint pushed open the door to Rocky's diner, the warmth of the place hit him first. The scent of fresh coffee, the low hum of conversation, the clatter of plates behind the counter. It was a comforting familiarity, a small sanctuary in a world that had long since moved too fast. But as the 5 bikers filed in behind him, their presence brought with them a dark cloud of tension. Martha Hudson, the diner's owner, stiffened behind the counter. A few customers lowered their heads, suddenly more interested in their meals. The soft buzz of conversation dwindled into silence. Jack and his gang weren't just looking for a meal. They were looking to make a statement. And tonight, Clint Eastwood had just become their chosen example. The moment Clint stepped into Rocky's diner, he felt it, the subtle shift in the air, the sudden weight of silence that clung to the room like an unspoken warning. This wasn't the usual warmth of his favorite late-night spot. The comforting murmur of conversation had vanished, replaced by a heavy, oppressive quiet. Martha Hudson, the no-nonsense owner of the diner, stood behind the counter, her hands gripping a rag she had forgotten to keep wiping with. A few regulars, a trucker nursing a late cup of coffee, an older couple who always sat in the far booth, looked down at their plates, pretending not to notice what was happening. They had seen men like these bikers before, and they knew better than to get involved. Behind him, the 5 intruders followed, their heavy boots clomping against the worn tile floor, their presence filling the small space with a suffocating tension. Jack dragged a chair across the floor with an agonizing screech before slamming it down across from Clint's booth. The way he sat, arms draped over the backrest, legs spread wide, wasn't casual. It was a challenge, a taunt. "We're gonna eat like kings tonight," Jack smirked, locking eyes with Clint. "And you're paying." The other bikers chuckled. One of them, Ray Mad Dog, reached for a menu from a nearby table. Instead of reading it, he snatched it up and tossed it to the floor, laughing as the pages fluttered. The young waitress, barely in her 20s, froze mid-step. Her wide eyes darted to Martha, waiting for direction, but Martha remained still, jaw tight, body tense. The room felt like a loaded gun, seconds from going off. But Clint didn't flinch. He didn't react to Jack's smirk, nor to the mocking display of dominance. Instead, he slowly reached for the glass of water in front of him, taking a deliberate sip, before setting it back down with a quiet clink. His legendary cold stare, the same one that had made outlaws in Western films hesitate, met Jack's without so much as a flicker of emotion. For a moment, nobody moved. The bikers had expected fear, maybe defiance, a desperate attempt to stand up for himself. They weren't prepared for silence. Jack's smirk faltered just a fraction. The silence dragged on until Jack, determined to regain control of the situation, let out a chuckle. "You sure are quiet, old man. That means you're smart. You know how this works." He turned toward the waitress, snapping his fingers. "Get us the biggest meal you got. Steaks, burgers, fries, and bring out a few beers while you're at it." The girl hesitated, looking at Martha for guidance. Martha, who had spent 3 decades running this diner, had dealt with rowdy truckers, aggressive drunks, and the occasional troublemaker. But this was different. She knew these men weren't just causing trouble for fun. They were testing the limits, seeing how much they could take before someone pushed back. And right now, Clint Eastwood was the only thing standing between them and complete control. The waitress took a shaky step forward. Clint raised a hand. "Let her be." His voice was quiet but firm, commanding without needing to be loud. The waitress stopped in her tracks. Jack leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Come on now. Don't make a big deal out of this. It's just a meal. You got money, don't you, old-timer?" One of the other bikers, a thick-set man with a buzz cut and tattoos creeping up his neck, let out a low chuckle. "If he don't, we can take it off his hands directly." Another biker snorted. "Assuming he's got anything left, probably living off Hollywood pension checks." Ray, still smirking, tapped his knife against the table, the rhythmic click-click-click adding an unsettling tempo to the moment. But Clint didn't move. He simply adjusted his hat, exhaling slowly. Something about the old man's lack of reaction was getting under their skin. They had barged in here, full of swagger and intimidation, expecting an easy target. Yet instead of cowering, instead of showing anger or fear, Clint sat there, patient, unwavering. Jack's fingers tightened against the back of his chair. This was wrong. He could feel control slipping through his fingers, and he didn't like it. With a sharp motion, he grabbed the bottle of ketchup from the table and slammed it down, red liquid squirting onto the counter. "What's the deal, huh? You too old to understand how this works. You pay up and nobody gets hurt. Simple as that." The diner was dead silent. Clint finally moved. Slowly, carefully, he reached for his napkin and wiped a single drop of ketchup off his sleeve, as if the entire exchange had been nothing more than an inconvenience. Then, at last, he spoke. "You boys came into the wrong town." Jack scoffed, but the shift in atmosphere was immediate. His laugh sounded forced. The bikers, moments ago so eager to escalate, found themselves suddenly hesitating, because it wasn't what Clint said. It was how he said it. Calm, cold, like he already knew how this was going to end. A few of the regulars exchanged glances, sensing the shift in power. Martha, still behind the counter, slowly began reaching for the old baseball bat she kept beneath the register. Jack, though still grinning, was starting to lose his patience. He leaned forward again, dropping his voice. "You think you're some kind of hero, some cowboy who can just stare people down until they back off." His fingers curled into a fist. "This ain't a movie, old man." For the first time that night, Clint smiled, just a little. And Jack didn't like it. The room felt like a coiled spring, seconds from snapping. The next move would decide everything. And Clint already knew exactly what he was going to do next. For a moment, it seemed as if time itself had stalled inside Rocky's diner. The low hum of the neon sign outside flickered faintly through the windows. The smell of grease, Coffee and freshly baked bread still lingered in the air. But all focus had shifted to the lone old man at the table, the one who had refused to cower, refused to fight back, and had done something far more dangerous. He had ignored their intimidation. Clint Eastwood's hand moved with measured precision as he reached into the inside pocket of his coat, retrieving an old but well-kept phone. The air in the diner grew impossibly dense. Jack leaned forward, scoffing. "Calling the cops?" he asked, his voice dripping with amusement. "You're even older than I thought. They work for us, old man." Ray, Mad Dog, let out a low laugh. "Yeah, what are they gonna do? Write us a ticket?" The rest of the bikers chuckled, slapping the table, shaking off the lingering tension that had begun to creep in when Clint first sat down. That was until one of them saw the screen. His name was Danny Smokes Carter, the youngest of the gang and perhaps the least hardened. He had seen a lot of things in his years with the crew, things that had taught him when to laugh and when to shut the hell up. This was the latter. As the screen of Clint's phone lit up, Danny's face drained of all color. He blinked, certain he was seeing it wrong. Then he whispered, almost to himself, "Jack, he's calling the governor." His voice shook just enough that even the others, still smirking, paused. Jack's grin faltered. "What?" Danny, his eyes wide, barely managed to swallow before repeating, louder this time, "He's calling the effing governor." The air shifted hard. Ray, previously lounging in his chair, sat up straighter. Another biker, Mitch, frowned and craned his neck, trying to confirm for himself. Jack's smug expression wavered before twisting into something else, something less sure, something borderline panicked, because this wasn't supposed to happen. For the first time that night, Clint let himself smirk. Not much. Just a slight twitch at the corner of his mouth, the kind of movement that a man made when he knew he was already in control of the situation. Jack watched as Clint brought the phone to his ear, unfazed, relaxed, like he had all the time in the world. And then he spoke. "Yeah, it's me." Silence. The bikers strained to hear, but Clint wasn't talking loud enough. All they could catch were short, clipped sentences, calm, matter of fact. "Rocky's Diner." 5 of them. A pause, a long one. Then the faintest nod. "Got it." With the same deliberate ease, Clint lowered the phone, ended the call, and set it gently on the table in front of him. Then he looked up. His cold, unwavering gaze settled on Jack, who was no longer grinning. The diner had fallen completely silent. The tension had changed, flipped. Jack, still trying to regain control, forced a chuckle, though it came out hollow. "Oh, please," he scoffed. "You expect me to believe you just dialed up the effing governor? What, you got him on speed dial?" Clint said nothing. He didn't need to. The way he sat, the way he watched them, completely unshaken, was enough. Danny still hadn't moved, his breathing just a little too fast. He was remembering something, something he had read a while back in an old newspaper. "Jack," Danny tried again, this time barely above a whisper. Jack shot him a glare. "What?" Danny licked his lips, still watching Clint like he was a ghost. "He used to be the mayor." Jack blinked. Danny kept going, his voice growing more urgent. "Not just that. He was the effing mayor of Carmel, and he had ties to state officials back when he was in office. The guy is basically a legend up north." If he called the governor, he trailed off, letting the weight of that thought settle like a bomb. The other bikers, now visibly uneasy, shifted in their seats. Jack's nostrils flared. So what? But even as he said it, the uncertainty was creeping into his voice. Ray, the most reckless of the bunch, clenched his jaw. "Man, this is bulls. We don't even know if he really called anybody." And then, as if on cue, the distant wail of sirens pierced the night. The bikers froze. Ray's jaw slackened. Jack, for all his bravado, felt something cold slide down his spine, because those sirens weren't distant for long. They were getting closer. Fast, and not just one patrol car. Jack's knuckles turned white where they gripped the table's edge. The first flash of red and blue lit up the windows of the diner, bathing the room in strobing light. Then another, and another. A full convoy of law enforcement was pulling up outside. For the first time that night, the bikers weren't the ones in control. A low voice broke the silence. "Still think I was bluffing?" Jack snapped his head back toward Clint, who was still calmly watching him, completely unshaken. Jack's stomach dropped. Because Clint wasn't even gloating. This wasn't a power move. This wasn't an act. This was just another night for him. Outside, car doors slammed. Heavy boots hit pavement, the sirens cut off. But the danger, it had only just begun. The first blaring wail of sirens sent a shockwave through Rocky's diner. Jack Donovan's smug expression froze mid-smirk, his fingers gripping the edge of the table just a little too tight. The red and blue lights flashing through the diner windows pulsed like a heartbeat, growing brighter, closer. The distant roar of engines that had once belonged to their motorcycles was now drowned out by the arrival of something much more powerful. It wasn't just a single cop car responding to a disturbance. It was a convoy, 3 police cruisers, a SWAT van, and enough officers to make even the cockiest criminals sweat. Outside, car doors slammed open in unison, the synchronized movement of trained professionals ready for a takedown. Inside the diner, no one spoke. The bikers, once so eager to throw their weight around, were now stone still. The tension was so thick it could have snapped like a wire. Then the door opened, and everything changed. The boots that crossed the threshold of Rocky's diner belonged to authority itself. Standing at 6'4" with broad shoulders and a presence that commanded a room before he even said a word was Police Chief David Calloway. He had been in law enforcement for over 30 years, and in all that time, he had seen every kind of criminal imaginable, the cocky, the desperate, the seasoned professionals. And then there were these idiots. Calloway scanned the room, his ice-blue eyes moving from the terrified waitress to Martha behind the counter, gripping a bat beneath the register. His gaze flickered over the few remaining customers, all holding their breath. Then his eyes landed on Clint Eastwood. Clint tilted his head slightly in greeting, a subtle acknowledgement between men who had seen too much of the world to be easily shaken. But Calloway wasn't here for Clint. He was here for them. His gaze settled on Jack Donovan, seated stiffly at the booth across from Clint, his once cocky posture now painfully rigid. Jack knew that look. It was the look of a man who had already decided his fate. Calloway took another step forward, resting one hand on his belt. His voice, when he spoke, was cold, professional, and utterly final. "Jack Donovan, Ray Mad Dog." Jack felt a trickle of sweat slip down the back of his neck. "You boys are wanted in 2 other states." The diner stayed dead silent. The only sound was the subtle creak of Jack's leather jacket as his body tensed. Calloway let the words sink in before delivering the final blow. "Looks like your luck just ran out." The last shred of Jack's bravado cracked. His fingers twitched at the edge of the table, knuckles white. His mind raced, calculating, trying to find a way out. He glanced at his crew. Ray Mad Dog looked like he had just swallowed broken glass. Danny Smokes was already half out of his chair, eyes darting toward the exit. Mitch and the other biker, Vince, weren't even pretending to play it cool anymore. The walls were closing in, and Jack knew it. He licked his lips, forcing a smirk, but the confidence wasn't there anymore. "Come on, Chief," he said, his voice a little too casual. "This is overkill, don't you think? We were just having a meal." Calloway's expression didn't change. "You were extorting an old man." Jack snorted, gesturing at Clint, who still hadn't moved, hadn't spoken. "That old man," he scoffed. "You know who he is, don't you?" Calloway tilted his head slightly. "I do." Jack leaned in, desperate to regain control. "Then you should also know that this is all just some misunderstanding. Look at him. He's a effing Hollywood legend, man. What do you think he told you, that we were gonna rob him?" That we were some big, bad wolves coming to eat Grandma's dinner, he laughed. But no one joined him, because it was already too late. Calloway didn't humor him. He didn't argue or bargain or even acknowledge the pathetic attempt at manipulation. Instead, he just nodded once, and that was the signal. The next few seconds happened fast. The officers moved as one, closing in. Jack's chair scraped violently against the floor as he shot to his feet, his hands instinctively reaching for his belt. A mistake. Hands where I can see him. Before Jack could react, two officers were already on him, twisting his arms behind his back with expert precision. A knee pressed into his spine, forcing him down onto the table. The cuffs clamped shut around his wrists. Ray didn't even try to fight, neither did Mitch or Vince. They all knew the game was up. Danny Smokes almost ran. Almost. But when the SWAT officer's voice thundered across the diner, he froze. "You so much as twitch and you're eating pavement. Don't test me." Danny slowly raised his hands. Seconds later, they were all restrained. Jack panted through clenched teeth, his cheek pressed against the table, the cold steel of the cuffs biting into his skin. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. They were the ones who picked fights, who walked into places and took what they wanted. But tonight they had picked the wrong man. And now, they were learning a lesson the hard way. The tension broke. The customers began breathing again, some exchanging looks of relief, others shaking their heads at the absolute stupidity of the bikers. Martha Hudson finally exhaled, relaxing her grip on the bat. Clint hadn't moved, not once. He simply lifted his glass of water, took a sip, and set it down again. As the officers escorted the bikers outside, Jack twisted his neck back toward him, his eyes burning with disbelief. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded. Clint glanced at him, calm, steady. Then, with a faint smirk, he finally spoke. "I was a mayor once, kid." Jack's face twisted in fury. But before he could respond, the officers shoved him forward, out into the cold night where the flashing red and blue lights awaited. The door swung shut behind them, and just like that, it was over. The red and blue lights of the police cruisers flashed through the windows of Rocky's diner, casting long shadows against the walls. The heavy sound of boots on pavement echoed as the officers dragged the defeated bikers outside, their cuffs clinking with each strained movement. For Jack Donovan, it was a moment of absolute humiliation. Everything had happened so fast. One moment he was in control, mocking an old man, flexing his authority. The next, he was being shoved into the back of a police cruiser like a common criminal. As the officers pushed him toward the car, he twisted his body just enough to look back through the diner's glass door. His eyes locked onto Clint Eastwood, and he still couldn't believe what had just happened. His voice, now filled with a mix of anger, confusion, and disbelief, broke through the cold night air. "How the hell do you have the governor's number?" Inside the diner, Clint barely looked up. He had already gone back to his meal, his spoon gently stirring the bowl of soup in front of him. The steam still rose from it, untouched through the entire ordeal. Without missing a beat, he lifted the spoon, took a sip, then shrugged. "I was a mayor once, kid." Jack's jaw clenched. There was nothing left to say. Before he could shout another word, the officers shoved him into the back seat, slamming the door shut. The police vehicles revved their engines, and one by one, they began pulling away from the diner, carrying Jack and his gang into the depths of a legal system that would not be kind to them. The tension that had gripped Rocky's diner finally melted away. It wasn't immediate. It never is after something like that. For a few seconds, it was just silence, a sort of collective breath being held as if waiting for something else to happen. Then, one by one, the customers exhaled. Martha Hudson was the first to speak. She had been clutching the bat under the counter so tightly that her knuckles had turned white, but now she slowly set it down, her grip finally relaxing. She let out a long breath and shook her head. "Jesus, Clint." He glanced up at her, his expression calm as ever. She huffed out a laugh. "I swear, you are the only man I know who can sit through a damn near hostage situation and still finish a meal like it's just another Tuesday." A chuckle rippled through the room, nervous at first but then genuine. The young waitress, still visibly shaken, approached the table hesitantly. "Mr. Eastwood, are you okay?" He gave her a slow, reassuring nod. She swallowed hard, then smiled a little. "Thanks for what you did." Clint set his spoon down and offered her the smallest of smiles. "It was nothing," Martha scoffed. "Nothing. Old man, you just saved my business. Hell, you saved this whole damn place from those scumbags." One of the regulars, a trucker who had been sitting in the back corner, raised his coffee mug. "To Clint Eastwood," he said, his voice full of admiration. Another patron nodded, clapping Clint gently on the shoulder as he walked by. And just like that, the tension was gone. In its place was relief, respect, and an unspoken acknowledgement of something rare, something you don't see every day. A man who didn't need to prove himself, because he already had. Near the door, a woman in her late 30s had been sitting at a corner booth, quiet, watching everything unfold with intense focus. She wasn't a regular. She wasn't a traveler passing through. She was a reporter. Anna Collins, journalist for the Sierra Falls Chronicle, had come in for a simple cup of coffee while finishing up notes on a completely different story. But now, her fingers hovered over her phone's keyboard, already typing out what she had just witnessed. This wasn't just another old man in a diner. This was Clint F.ing Eastwood, staring down 5 armed bikers without flinching, making a single phone call and watching as the entire town's law enforcement came down like a hammer. This was a story the world needed to hear. Anna immediately hit dial on her editor's number. The second the call connected, she whispered urgently, "Boss, you're not going to believe what just happened." While the diner buzzed with hushed conversation, Clint had already gone back to his meal. It was still hot, still exactly how he liked it. He took another slow spoonful, savoring the taste, as if nothing had happened, because for him, nothing had. This was just another day. Another moment in a long life filled with hard lessons, unshakable resolve, and the quiet kind of power that doesn't need to be flaunted. He didn't puff out his chest, didn't bask in the attention, didn't care about being a hero. Because real legends don't need to announce themselves. They just act. And then they finish their damn soup. As the last traces of red and blue lights disappeared into the night, Rocky's diner returned to its usual hum of conversation. But for those who had witnessed what had just transpired, something lingered, a lesson, unspoken yet undeniable. Clint Eastwood had done something extraordinary, not by raising his fists, not by trading insults, and certainly not by giving in to fear. He had won without lifting a finger, and in that there was a powerful truth, one that every person in that diner and every person watching this story unfold could take to heart. 1. Strength isn't about noise, it's about presence. The bikers thought that power came from intimidation, from being the loudest and the most aggressive in the room. But real power is silent, patient, and precise. Clint didn't react to their threats. He observed, he calculated, and then he acted decisively. Too often, people mistake aggression for dominance, thinking that forcing others into submission makes them strong. But the truth, the strongest person in the room is the one who doesn't need to prove it. 2. Experience will always outmatch arrogance. Jack Donovan and his crew assumed that because Clint was old, he was weak. But wisdom, patience, and experience will always outmatch reckless bravado. A younger man might have fought back. A more fearful man might have begged. Clint did neither. He simply used what he knew, who he was, and let the world handle the rest. The lesson: never underestimate the quiet ones. The ones who have lived, learned, and understand the value of patience. 3. Respect is earned, not demanded. The bikers stormed into that diner expecting submission. They wanted respect, but they sought it through fear, through control. And yet, at the end of it all, they left in handcuffs, humiliated, powerless. Clint never demanded respect. He commanded it, not through force, but through the weight of his presence, the strength of his character, and the way he carried himself even in the face of hostility. And that's a lesson we all can take. True respect isn't about making people fear you. It's about making them admire you. In life, you will encounter bullies, manipulators, and those who believe power comes from taking it from others. But if this story teaches anything, it's that true power comes from knowing who you are, standing your ground, and never letting anyone shake your foundation. Because real strength doesn't shout. It doesn't posture. It simply waits for the right moment, and then it changes everything. And that's why legends like Clint Eastwood don't just exist in movies. They exist in real life. And they remind us that sometimes the greatest battles are won not with fists, but with wisdom, patience, and an unshakable sense of self.